There we go. All you.
Awesome. All right. Can you see my screen?
100%. It's perfect.
Awesome. Okay. Hi everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Kiana Young. I'm currently a wildlife biologist with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game in Anchorage, Alaska. Right now, I don't actually study mountain goats right now. I'm studying wolves, wolverine, and lynx, so fur bearers, but I did my master's degree and my master's research on mountain goats. So today I'll be talking about the kind of the latter part of that research, which we're still just finishing up. And shout out to Kevin White and Aaron Schaefer, who were a big part of this project and on this paper. So the specific research that I'm going to be talking about today, the paper is titled Unraveling the Complex Biogeographic and Anthropogenic History of Alaska's Mountain Goats, which is a little bit of a mouthful, but kind of the main goal in this is we wanted to, with mountain goats in Alaska, look back in time a little bit and figure out like what are those important events that occurred that led mountain goat populations to kind of the distribution and the population structure that they're at today. And we wanted to look at both the biogeographic, so that the kind of natural landscape changes, in our case, in glaciations and ice age events, but then also the anthropogenic, so the human kind of mediated changes. And in our case, we'll be talking about some translocations that happened with mountain goats in Alaska. So just a little bit of background on some of the kind of glacial history of Alaska. The main glacial event or ice age event that a lot of people talk about when they're looking at wildlife distributions and kind of the evolutionary history of wildlife in Alaska is the Wisconsin glaciation. And this happened from around 100,000 years ago and then ended around 11,000 years ago. And specifically within Alaska and southern Alaska, the Cordilleran ice sheet was the main one that affected the species, and where they kind of were on the landscape and where they kind of were able to move into over that time. But beyond just that kind of big major ice age and glaciation event that happened, there's been some more recent ones. And the earlier part of my master's research, my first chapter had focused on specifically on Glacier Bay, which is a park in Southeast Alaska that had a smaller scale ice age event they call like the Little Ice Age that happened only 300 years ago. And so there's kind of this difference, and we wanted to know, it's like, was it this big Wisconsin glaciation that happened, or was it these smaller ice ages that kind of affected how mountain goats kind of exist across the landscape? And then on a kind of a human perspective, humans and mountain goats have coexisted for a long time in Alaska. And it's important to realize the cultural significance that mountain goats have. So their fur has been used for clothing, for art. Their horns can be carved into tools and spoons. And then you can see them represented in kind of some art and in some stories, like on the lower right there, that's in Glacier Bay, that's in a tribal house on a house pole. And then a little bit more recently, mountain goats are also really valued for hunting, for meat, and as kind of a trophy animal, but also as just kind of one of those iconic alpine species for wildlife viewing, for tourism, and for, like wildlife photography. In Alaska, mountain goats live in kind of the south central and southeastern part of the state. They're kind of coastal species in Alaska, compared to Dall sheep, which occupy somewhat of a similar habitat but are a little less coastal. And mountain goats, they exist on 3 different islands in Alaska, which if you know stuff about mountain goats, you know that they're not known to be very good swimmers. And so it's a little surprising that they're on these 3 islands. But it turns out that it's because mountain goats were actually put on those islands in the last 100 years. And so I'll go into kind of how that plays into some of our research. And a little more specifically, so these are the 3 islands that these translocations occurred: Kodiak Island, Baranof Island and Ravella Island, which is down near Ketchikan. And there's this period starting in the early 1900s or around the 1920s where hunting became more popular. And so it became really common for people to move game species to different areas where they didn't exist or they thought that they didn't exist prior. And this happened quite a few times with mountain goats, but three instances where it was successful, meaning that mountain goats still exist in high numbers there today. And there's some pictures on the right of those transplants happening, and then some mountain goats on Baranof Island that stayed pretty near the buildings where they were released. And particularly Baranof Island is of interest because there's been some evidence previously that has said that mountain goats had actually existed. Baranof Island was a cryptic refugium for mountain goats over the Wisconsin glaciation, and they actually exist on the island before this transplant occurred. And so part of our research and what we wanted to do with our data was kind of dig into this a little bit more and see if our data supports that theory at all. So our main objectives for this research was to identify distinct subpopulations. How many different kind of distinct groupings of mountain goats are there in Alaska, and where are those boundaries, to infer the demographic history. And so if we have those subpopulations, how long ago did they separate from each other, and what kind of pattern of separation occurred? And then finally, to simulate the island translocations to kind of evaluate this cryptic refugium theory that exists. So in terms of sample collection, part of my master's fieldwork was doing non-invasive genetic sampling, and we did that with pellet swabs. And so we would follow the goats around, and when they pooped, we would swab the poop and we could get genetics off of that. We also would get samples from other research projects like collaring projects. When researchers had the animals down, they would take a tissue sample, but the vast majority of the samples for this project were hunter harvested samples. And hunter harvested samples are really efficient for us because they're really easy for us to get, and we can cover a really broad range of samples that, like, we couldn't get to most of these places if it was just our efforts, but because the hunters are hunting throughout the range of mountain goats, we're able to get samples from that range. And so we had over 800 samples we ended up genotyping, and we felt pretty happy with the coverage that we got that covered a lot of the mountain goats range in Alaska. This was a genetic study, and I won't go too deep into the genetics because I know it's easy to get bogged down in the weeds with that. And ultimately, I think of genetics more as just kind of a tool for answering some questions in ecology and conservation and management. But just briefly, we used microsatellites for this. And the main thing you would need to know about microsatellites is that they're a really efficient way of looking at clustering of a species or of a population, so you can find those kind of subpopulations, and then you can look at some genetic diversity statistics and be able to compare them, which is what we did. So going back to that first objective, we wanted to identify distinct mountain goat subpopulations in Alaska. And the first thing that we did was just kind of wanted to get kind of a broad sense. And so we put all of these samples into a PCA, or principal components analysis. And we wanted to look for some initial clustering. And you can see these are all the samples. You can see there's kind of like a sideways V that there could be some clustering, but it's hard to tell on the right. And then on the left, there is a much more clear cluster of samples. So we saw that, and then our next step was to throw these samples on a map and say, like, does this clustering of samples also make sense geographically speaking? So we did that, and it actually made a lot of sense. There is this big kind of initial split of mountain goats between South Central Alaska and Southeast Alaska. And we wanted to dig further into it, and besides just doing kind of looking for clusters visually, we used a program called Structure, which is really commonly used in population genetics. And It's just a better way of it uses statistics to find the most likely number of mountain goat or of groupings, in our case, of mountain goats. And ultimately, structure told us that Alaska has 4 distinct subpopulations of mountain goats. So that South Central grouping still existed, and then the Southeast Alaska grouping split even further into 3 distinct subpopulations. And so one being, we called it NSE for Northern Southeast, SSE for Southern Southeast, and then interestingly, Baranof Island was off on its own as its own distinct subpopulation. So we have these 4 subpopulations. Next, we wanted to know, when did they split off from one another, and how did they split off from one another? And so for that, we use this other program called DIY ABC, which is just a coalescent software. And what we did is we just provided it with all of these different possible scenarios of how this split could have occurred. So it could have been that Baranof Island split off first, and then the other one split off from each other. It could have been that South Central split off first, or it could have been that they all split off at the exact same time. And so we give it all these possibilities. It kind of generates a example data set and then compares it to our data set, looking at like which one is the most likely. And ultimately, we found out that the most likely scenario was that the South Central mountain goats split off from each other, and then the 3 Southeast Alaska populations split off from each other after that, but around the same time. And that initial split happened around 13,600 years ago, and then that second split happened around 7,500 years ago. And then when we think about this in context, it does make sense. First of all, that initial split, because we saw on that PCA there was that clustering of South Central and then Southeast, that it makes sense that South Central was the first one to split off, and then it's had more time to become distinct and to become isolated. And then kind of following that, then more recently, the Southeast Alaska subpopulations split from one another. And in terms of time frame, it also makes sense. You know, we're looking kind of longer scale at that Wisconsin glaciation, at the extent of the Wisconsin glaciation, which is called the last glacial maximum, happened around 20 or 21,000 years ago. And then since then, between 21,000 years ago and kind of 11,000 years ago, when this Wisconsin glaciation ended, there is that big retreat of ice. And so right around probably 14,000 years ago, enough available habitat opened up that allowed animals, including mountain goats, to kind of spread throughout this area and split apart from one another. And then as more and more habitat became suitable, after the end of the Wisconsin, between the Pleistocene and the Holocene periods, then they kind of were able to split even further. And this tracks with a lot of species, including wolves, kind of some moose, bears, and smaller mammals in Alaska, that we're looking at kind of this time frame of around 14,000 years ago, having that initial split and kind of individuals moving up north in the state. So then that brings us to that third objective of, we wanted to simulate these translocations. And I'll bring back this figure of those 3 translocations again. And the really cool thing for us about these translocations, these transplants that happen, is that they're really well recorded. So we have the exact year or years that they occurred. We have the source population, the population that they got individuals from. We have the total number of animals that they moved, and often we even had like the number of males and the number of females. And then we have survey data from that point up until present day to see what the trajectory of the population was, or to have an estimate of what the trajectory of the population was. And so we were able to use this information, all of this data, to build these simulations. And what we really wanted to do is to simulate our own translocation event to see if these 3 islands matched up with what a simulation would show. And so we basically got, you know, if it was Baranof Island, 18 individuals from Tracy Arm, 100 years ago, roughly, and then simulated what would happen with those individuals if it were 18 individuals from that year, and then compared that fake population, that simulated population, to what we're actually observing on Baranof Island. And we obviously can't compare direct genotypes because you don't ever know what mutations or how things are going to evolve or what the genotypes are going to be. But you can compare is some diversity statistics. And so we use things like the levels of heterozygosity, the allelic richness, and the levels of inbreeding. And so these things that are kind of representative of how genetically diverse a population is. And we were able to compare the simulated population to kind of what is seen now. And the interesting thing that we found from that is that Kodiak Island and Ravella Island matched quite closely. Like we're within the confidence bounds of what the simulation said they would be. And so it matched really closely. Baranof Island was different in that Baranof, what we actually observe today, Baranof Island is more genetically diverse than we would expect it to be if only 18 animals were moved from Tracy Arm to Baranof Island in the year of 1923. And so that kind of starts to provide some evidence that this one transplant does not explain what is going on in Baranof Island. We can't necessarily say, or it brings up kind of a few different possible explanations. And so I talked earlier about this theory of an endemic refugial population, and this does provide support for that theory somewhat, but it also doesn't, there are other theories that could explain what we found. And so another one being that additional translocation events have occurred, whether that was, around that time or just before that time, or a lot earlier. Some native groups, native communities have been known to do what's called gift diplomacy, where they'll actually gift animals, wildlife, or groups of animals from one area to another. And so that's definitely a possibility. The third explanation being that mountain goats could have naturally dispersed to Baranof Island after the Wisconsin glaciation, after the last glacial maximum, but before this 1923 transplant. I will say it's probably unlikely that it would have been relatively recent because it would be a fairly big swim for them. And mountain goats are not, like I said, not known to be great long distance swimmers. And even some research on other species like bears on Baranof Island and the ABC Islands show that bears aren't even really moving between those islands. And so if bears aren't doing it across the water, mountain goats likely aren't either, but it doesn't rule out mountain goats. If there was a period of time where ice covered the fjord after that last glacial maximum, then it's very possible that mountain goats could have traveled across an icy fjord to get to Baranof Island if there was suitable habitat at the time. So kind of going back through the objectives, we found that there are 4 main subpopulations in Alaska. That initial big split happened around 13,600 years ago, and then an additional split in Southeast Alaska occurred around 7,000 years ago, or 7,600 years ago. And then finally, the simulations largely aligned with what is observed, except for Baranof Island, which the genetics are indicating that mountain goats existed on this island prior to this recorded transplant. Some main conclusions that we feel can kind of be in the broader context of things is that it's really important to account for both the natural and the anthropogenic forces acting upon populations. Oftentimes, it's easy to just look at one of them, like just look at the ice age events or the glaciation events or volcanic or fire or whatever it might be, or just look at the human disturbance events. But as we have more and more time of humans and wildlife interacting, it's important to account for all of these forces and look at them together. And then the last one just being that genetics can be a really important tool in understanding the population structure. And then a good example is Baranof Island, where if we didn't have some genetic information, it would be really difficult to know, to gain this information and understand like if there were mountain goats there previously. And if part of our goal in conservation is maintaining biodiversity, that includes genetic diversity. And so it is important to look at the genetics and kind of keep track of the genetics, and use that as you're kind of looking into ecology and conservation and management and whatever it might be. And with that, thank you. This was a collaboration between a lot of different people. Trent University is the university I went to, the Park Service, Department of Fish and Game, and then of course, thank you to Rocky Mountain Goat Alliance for some additional funding near the end there, which really helped me out.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I am not seeing any questions in the comments, and I'm not seeing any hands raised. So I think we'll let the people here stew on that, and we can move into Forrest's presentation if you're ready to go.
Yep, just a second. Great talk, Kiana. All right, can you see that?
Yes, we are good to go.
All right, I'll kick it off or continue. So thanks for folks who are here or are watching it later. So I'm currently a postdoc at Colorado State University working on unrelated things right now, but today I'm going to be talking about some of my dissertation research, which was on mountain goats, really focusing on how high summer temperatures influence resource selection by cold adapted species and mountain goats. So I just wanted to take a minute at the beginning to just appreciate co-authors and collaborators on this. So Larissa Bailey, Ken Wilson, Deanne McGrath, and Joel Berger are all with Colorado State University. And this was done in close collaboration with Mark Beal, who's with the National Park Service at Glacier National Park. And really all of them played a critical role in this project at various stages. So just a quick disclaimer here too. This presentation is really preliminary results, which are subject to change and shouldn't be cited, but working on putting together final results and analyses, which will be made publicly available and upon peer review. So really just stepping back and broadly, why cold adapted species and why are they really an interesting, or what can they tell us in an interesting group to study? So over the past 50 years, we've seen this gradual but substantial increase in global temperatures. And moreover, even under the most optimistic scenarios in the future, this warming trend is going to continue and likely accelerate for some time. And what really becomes rapidly apparent is there's this broad recognition that our climate and the cryosphere is experiencing this rapid changes with broad impacts. And this realization is well reflected by an abundance of recent media coverage from a variety of outlets. And so it's just something that is broadly recognized by not just scientists, but also the public. And concurrent with these changes in climate, we've seen really dramatic declines in biodiversity during the past 50 years. So while there's a myriad of reasons for these declines, which include changes in land use and habitat fragmentation, its future projections of global biodiversity show the strong influence that warming temperatures are forecasted to have. And what we see is that biodiversity loss is forecasted to be substantially greater under scenarios where we see increased warming. So looking at large-scale responses by species, across taxa, we've seen really broad responses, which include distributional shifts, both northwards and upwards in elevation. And the many cold-adapted species have become largely limited in range and distribution to areas with persistent snow and cold. And additionally, it's clear that the continued loss of persistent snow will inevitably alter habitat quality and availability for these species. So if we look back in time at fossil records for mountain goats specifically and look at where they used to be found, we see that really they had these distributions that were much further south. So this is including Ereminos americanus, our current extant species, and a very similar extinct species as well. So they were found geographically as far south as Mexico. At a more granular level, we've seen behavioral responses by individual animals in response to warming temperatures, and these include changes in temporal activity, where individuals exhibit greater movement during cooler portions of the day, and use of cooler microsites, such as shaded areas, especially for bedding, and also the use of water and snow patches to cool down. So for species found at high elevations and latitudes, or species that are found at high elevations and latitudes, are really likely to be among the most strongly impacted by these globally warming temperatures. And we've already seen that glaciers and persistent snow have already been almost completely lost from some low altitude mountain ranges. And further, we know that these impacts are forecasted to increase in both rate and severity as climates continue to change. So in North America, our sort of present day, annually persistent glaciers and ice are really pretty restricted to the extreme mountainous regions in the Northwest. And what we quickly realized is there's this really strong correlation between the native range of mountain goats and that of persistent glaciers and ice. However, it's also worth noting that mountain goats have been introduced at lower latitudes, including Colorado, and are apparently doing reasonably well in some of these populations as well. So, the strong association between these periglacial zones and mountain goats really makes them an ideal candidate species in which to assess the behavioral impacts of warming temperatures, especially so for populations on sort of the southern edge. So why is snow important? Well, it turns out there's been remarkably little empirical research on the benefits of snow, and many of these purported benefits have not been strongly supported in past studies. However, in sort of related work, we recently found that for mountain goats, high levels of insect harassment during summer months are reduced substantially through use of snow patches. So there does appear to be a strong incentive to use snow. So why else are we interested in mountain goats? Well, they're an iconic high elevation obligate, as you all know, with broad public and cultural interest, which is why folks are here. And so for this study, we decided, we monitored a native population in Glacier National Park, which is one of the larger, strong populations towards the southern edge of their native range. So just a little bit on sort of their adaptation to the cold and climate and what makes them unique. So mountain goats are extremely well adapted to colder temperatures. They have thick pelage, which keeps them warm in the winter and allows them to inhabit the extreme environments in which they persist. They can frequently be seen using snow patches in both summer and winter and are comfortable navigating the snow and the ice from a young age. And they experience this really strong variation in climate between summer and winter. So this is well captured by differences in solar radiation shown here and highlights the challenges that they may face during summer months when they have these much higher levels of solar radiation on the landscape. So as climates warm, this raises the question of how they'll change their behavior when there's a possible mismatch between their cold adaptation and local climate. So we were interested in understanding the changes or challenges that cold adapted species face and the behavioral changes we may see, especially for these southerly populations. And in Glacier National Park, we've seen this high annual variability in snowpack. So in this figure, we show the last day of snow through the summer, in which satellite data were able to detect snow on the ground. And here, later days, so longer into the summer, are shown in brighter colors, and earlier days in the summer where snow is lost sooner are shown in darker colors. So this highlights not just the variability, but also that if snow modulates resource selection by mountain goats, the presence of snow on the landscape and annual variability may have strong influences on mountain goat behavior. So what's more predictable across years is the seasonal variation or melt of snow on the landscape. So we're interested in using this variability in the persistence of snow coupled with periods of warm temperatures to understand resource selection by mountain goats. I just want to step back a little bit and provide a very brief primer on resource selection functions. So fundamentally, resource selection functions compare used versus available habitat or resources. So if you imagine we have a set of known locations of use in the landscape, from that we can identify a home range or area of interest for this animal and evaluate relative selection within this area. To do this, we randomly generate available locations and define selection as disproportionate use of a particular resource relative to its availability on the landscape. So a number of studies have already evaluated resource selection by mounted goats, right? This isn't a novel concept, but consistently we've seen the explanatory factors that or important factors have included topographic and environmental features. And given the number of visitors that we have at Glacier National Park, we wanted to include a measure of human impact on the landscape. So we used proximity to road and proximity to trail to count for human presence. And of course, we're interested in looking at the influence of the presence of snow on their selection as well. So what we wanted to do was assess the use of this resource, proximity to snow, and incorporate the changing availability of snow on the landscape through time. So for snow, we decided to use the measure of last day of snow, as I illustrated earlier. And as we saw, this change, sort of accounts for the changing availability through time and in different years. And because we were really interested in understanding how behaviors are changing relative to periods with the warmest temperatures and the least availability of snow, we decided to focus our analysis here on the summer months in Glacier National Park, which is essentially May through August. So briefly, I just want to describe how we assessed snow. So we used the MODIS snow cover product, which relies on the normalized difference snow index, or NDSI. So this uses the normalized ratio between the green band and the shortwave infrared band to derive a probability of snow and classify pixels that are at least 50% covered in snow. And we chose MODIS, the MODIS satellite network here, because while the spatial resolution is relatively low at 500 meter pixels, the temporal resolution is really high with daily samples. And through our exploratory analyses, these data best matched with on-the-ground readings of snow cover. So given the high rate of change seasonally, the temporal resolution was key to match with the rapid melt of snow during summer months. And then we were able to then assess the proximity of snow based on the date of use for a given location. So to obtain spatial use data, we captured and colored mounted goats during 2018, 2019, and 2020. And from those individuals, we're able to track spatial use through time with satellite GPS upload colors, and we're able to determine which areas animals used. And again, if you recall, we're interested in climate and the presence of snow on the landscape and how that's affecting these used locations. So for these animals, we recorded all used locations, which after 4 years of data look something like this. From those, we're able to generate home range estimates for each individual, and for each individual, a set of available points on the landscape. I should note, as a part of this broader study, we also considered availability at a finer scale based on a step selection process, but for the sake of brevity here, I'm not going to be presenting on those today. So I wanted to provide also a quick overview of our analytical methods. So we used a Bayesian hierarchical resource selection model. And in this, we generated a population level hyperprior for each covariate, and then treated individual as a random effect and estimated an effect for each individual. From those, we derived the population level effect based on the mean of individual effects. And we also applied the same process at these two different spatial scales. So diving into the results or preliminary results here. So on the left side of the y-axis, we have our covariates of interest that I mentioned earlier. So we have proximity to escape, elevation, proximity to road, proximity to trail, solar radiation, and proximity to snow. And then on the bottom here, we have the relative magnitude of effect on selection by mounted goats. So here's what we found, and just to walk through these, what we see is that as expected, and as we know from mounted goat behavior, topographic features are important. So we see increased use of areas near to escape terrain or slopes greater than 33 degrees, and higher elevation areas within home ranges. For our anthropogenic features or measures, the strength of this effect was really pretty striking and suggests that these or human presence on the landscape really does play a key role in determining spatial patterns of use. So selection for these features is likely driven by the presence of anthropogenic salts, such as salt runoff from roads, and perhaps avoidance of predators through increased proximity to humans. So in terms of our environmental covariates here, we found some selection for both solar radiation and proximity to snow. And this selection for solar radiation suggests, that's a little surprising, but suggests that there may actually be additional capacity to avoid thermal exposure through behavioral changes in resource use. For proximity to snow, we found animals were slightly more likely to use areas in close proximity, although the relative magnitude of effect here was not strong and suggests this isn't a major factor in comparison to other covariates we considered. So in the context of previous studies, none of these results are particularly surprising. A lot of this we've already has been pretty well documented. So we wanted to take this a step further and look at how selection changes on the warmest days of the year. And to do that, we elected to distill our data using the hottest 15% of days in comparison to cooler summer days. So we used temperature data from a centrally located snowtail site at Flat Top Mountain, and for each year, identified days with temperatures in the top 15th percentile, and used those as our kind of warmest days. So in this figure, we have the same set of covariates on the left and evaluate selection for the warmest days separately. So the rightmost panel here just shows the change in selection between those two periods. So here's what those results look like. And right off the bat, we can see there's a really substantial difference in resource selection during these warmest days. So notably, selection for proximity to escape terrain, which is universally one of the most important covariates for mountain goats, decreased dramatically. Additionally, as we might expect, we see increased use of cooler habitats, so those at high elevations and those with reduced solar radiation. And we also see increased attraction to anthropogenic features, which may potentially expose these animals to higher rates of disturbance. Last, we see a shift to use of areas further from snow. And while this may seem a little bit surprising, our other work I mentioned earlier suggests that snow patches don't appear to confer thermal benefits, and instead they're being used to mitigate insect harassment. So this result really just further indicates that those habitats are not being used for mitigation or mitigating increased thermal exposure. So in sum here, we found the features or the factors most strongly influencing resource selection of these populations, which are also subject to change under increasing temperatures, are the selection for topographic features and to a lesser extent snow, proximity to anthropogenic features, access to escape terrain, and ectoparasitic disturbance through insects, which is mediated by this use of snow patches. And with these increasing temperatures or under increased temperatures, what we see is that there's an increased use of high elevation areas, increased proximity to humans, a decreased, potentially decreased access to escape terrain, and decreased use of snow. So to place these results in a little bit broader context, we found evidence that changes in spatial use associated with avoidance of high temperatures are also associated with potential trade-offs, which include this increased or decreased access to escape terrain or potentially increased predation risk, and the possibility of increased disturbance through humans through their increased proximity, and again, sort of this reduced ability to avoid insects because there's less snow available or proximity to it. And really strikingly, though, we saw these strong changes in characteristic behaviors. So namely, the use of areas in close proximity to escape terrain, suggesting that there's really key behavioral changes during these warmest periods. So while the demographic consequences of these changes, if any, are not yet known, they highlight this concern over compromises that species and mountain goats might be making as they're adapting to warmer temperatures. With that, so thank you so much for your interest. It was great to share some of this work, and it'll be a pleasure to answer any questions either here or feel free to reach out to me with any down the line. Thanks a lot.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Forrest. Yeah, I am not seeing any questions in the comments, and I'm not seeing any raised hands. But there are only a few of us here, so if you have any questions, now is your chance, and you are welcome to unmute yourself and just shout them out. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any. So I think I actually have one question for Kiana from the beginning. You had mentioned, like the importance of genetic diversity when it comes to biodiversity, and the risks of inbreeding. And I think we're all aware of kind of what can happen if you have too much inbreeding. But I was just curious about how long it would take to see those effects in a population. To my understanding, there are quite a few very isolated populations of mountain goats, and yeah, so I would just be curious about how long it would actually take to see those negative impacts of inbreeding.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's hard to have an answer for. And inbreeding is an interesting one because it's not, so there's like inbreeding, which is, this thing that happens when closely related individuals breed with each other. And then there's inbreeding depression. And inbreeding depression is that thing that we all think about of kind of like a reduction in fitness or a reduction in survival that is because of inbreeding. So it's that increase in disease that you think about when you think about like why inbreeding is so bad. And interesting, like, with mountain goats in Alaska, like that Kodiak Island population, it's from our data, it's definitely like the most inbred of the populations, but we're not necessarily seeing kind of the negative effects of inbreeding. And so it depends on the species, kind of the population, and kind of what arises from it. But with kind of some of those really small isolated populations, if there is a lot of inbreeding, if there's really no immigration or emigration happening, then I don't know an exact answer, but I would say probably within 10 generations, 20 generations, you kind of start seeing that. But again, it's you hear inbreeding and it's kind of this really scary thing, and I think it can be really bad and negative, but in itself, having more inbred is not like an immediate, like, we need to do something about this, which is something that was interesting to me with genetics. And there are some populations that are quite inbred and are showing no inbreeding depression. And that's just kind of, I guess maybe partially the luck of the draw or the genetics of that species or of that population.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Alrighty, I'm not seeing any hands up. I'm not seeing any unmutes, and I'm not seeing any questions in the comments. So I think I'm going to end the recording, and I can kind of give everybody back a few extra minutes of their evening. Thank you again so much, Kiana and Forrest. That was some great information and a lot of information, and we very much appreciate your time this evening and all of the information and the work that you've done. So thank you so much.
Thank you for putting this together. Appreciate it.
Awesome.